The Food Radio Project.
What do Indians really think about eating oysters? How is it that a food that's savored as a delicacy across the globe has been pretty much overlooked by 1 billion people? That's what we're asking on this episode of the Food Radio Project. I spoke to Professor Ravindra Khare from the University of Virginia. Professor Khare studies the anthropology of food in India. I asked him for the long view on oysters.
Eating sheep is a very different thing than eating other kinds of seafood in the Indian context.
Professor Khare uses the Sanskrit word for oysters, seep. He said that for the most part, in India, oysters haven't primarily been considered food.
Sheep is very closely related to moti, the pearl that is produced out of oysters and so on. So mining of oysters has always been more for getting to those pearls rather than oysters as a foodstuff.
There's no mention of oysters at all in books like K.T. Achaya's Historical Companion of Indian Food. I did find a report from 100 years ago, written by a marine biologist called James Hornell. In Edible Mollusks of the Madras Presidency, he wrote,
"Unfortunately, the better class of Indians do not appreciate oysters, and none will make use of this excellent food supply. Among Hindus, only the lower classes of shore dwellers eat oysters, together with some Mohammedans and Indian Christians."
So the communities that eat oysters are found in small pockets along the coast. Professor Khare said that regular fare in one state can easily be completely unfamiliar to another.
Food over very long history of India and culture actually has always been regional. And just think about that in Punjab. Thinking about oysters in Punjab is just completely, people will roll their eyes actually.
Even along the coast, oyster consumption is more regional in nature than, say, clams or mussels. That's what Dr. Sunil Mohamed at the Central Marine Fisheries Research Institute, or the CMFRI, told me.
In coastal areas, generally all seafood is eaten. Clam, oysters, mussels. And it's more so on the west coast than on the east coast. For example, in the east coast, although clams are available in plenty, and so also oysters, clams is mainly used for the shell by the cement and carbide industry.
Dr. Mohamed is the head of the Molluscan Fisheries Division at the CMFRI. He said that of all shellfish, oysters are the least commonly eaten in India. They're still a subsistence food today. If they are sold, it's only at local markets, and usually for as cheap as 1 rupee for each piece of meat.
The traditional thing is they shuck the oysters, they take the meat, and the meat is sold. Okay.
In regions like Kerala, traditionally people make oyster pickle or oyster curry. Sometimes oysters are fried with masala. Local communities in India never eat their oysters raw.
I remember, for example, oysters were marketed in my home in shucked form, raw shucked form. Okay. But then people would buy it and then cook it. Okay. I have never eaten an oyster live in my younger days.
What do Indian oysters even taste like raw? I realized I had no idea because I've never tried one. Dr. Mohamed said that he'd heard they taste a lot like East Coast oysters in the US.
It's very similar to the American oyster, Crassostrea virginica. At least that's what the Americans who come here have told me. Okay.
He said they're not at all like Pacific oysters or European oysters. So I guess that means that they're brinier and more mineral tasting, less creamy and smooth. I asked Thomas Zacharias what he thought. He's the chef at Bombay Canteen, a restaurant in Mumbai that serves modern Indian cuisine made with local ingredients.
Here, there wasn't depth of flavor of the oyster, and it was a little, for lack of a better word, murky taste, but still way, way better than what I expected local oysters taste like. In fact, the ones from Cochin that I've tasted are like much, much better. It's clean, crisp, and a lot more meatier.
I wanted to know why we don't really see raw oysters on the menu at mainstream restaurants. Even if they aren't eaten that way traditionally, wouldn't people in bigger cities be interested in trying them? Chef Thomas said there are many reasons, but when it comes down to it, restaurants can't really count on a huge demand for raw oysters. Not everybody loves them.
People who ordered it loved it, but it didn't sell as much as you would want it to. And that didn't really surprise me because there are a few things that are deterrents in oyster consumption. One is, as Indians, we're not used to eating raw stuff, especially meat or seafood. Secondly, there's a misconception about the fact that oysters come from dirty waters and you can get very sick from oysters.
Dr. Mohamed agreed. Indians have a lot of misgivings about oysters.
A lot of people are aware of this, but not confident to eat it because they are always associated these bivalves with stomach problems and food poisoning and all that.
So I went back to Professor Khare and I asked him, why does India have such a problem with raw oysters?
Oyster specifically is very long associated with something else rather than eating it, and definitely not gulping it raw. So what you find is that raw food, uncooked food will be more often consumed by those people who we call sadhu, sannyasi, renouncers and so on, because they don't have the facility to cook that every day with them. But householders have always preferred to cook their food and eat it. And it's not only cultural, it's not only historical, but it is very practical, because that's how, combined with the spices, India has always curtailed infections.
So is there a way for us to get over our cultural hang-up? What would it take for Indians to start slurping oysters down by the dozen? Professor Khare said that although oysters might never be as widely accepted as fish, they could still become less of an oddity than they are now. He said value in almost all kinds of food is a shifting perception. And he reminded me that 200 years ago in the West, oysters were a poor man's food, and now they're a luxury. So oysters could find a place on the Indian table, if they're marketed successfully. Dr. Mohamed told me that they are trying to help create a market for oysters. His institute, the CMFRI, developed the technology to farm oysters in the backwaters. But 3 years ago, they also hosted a food festival in Kerala called Shellcon, where around 5,000 people got to try oysters, raw.
We develop an interest in people, especially for live oysters. As is done in Europe and America, where a lot of people eat oysters in a live condition. So we developed a system of purification of these oysters and we showed it to some of the restaurants. We interacted with chefs of some of the high-end restaurants. Got those people on board. And slowly now we do have a small market for live oysters.
He said that they also focus on the health aspects of shellfish when they try to make oysters more popular, like the fact that they're much lower in cholesterol than shrimp. But that's not the only angle.
We do market oysters in another way, that is the reproductive benefits, the aphrodisiac, but it may be a myth, may not be a myth, because these oysters contain a lot of zinc, and zinc is one of the a metal which is much involved in reproductive process in human beings as well.
Dr. Mohamed said they've even tried telling the story of Casanova to market it. Really, what they're trying to do is get the interest going in the metros. People in the heart of Punjab might roll their eyes, just like Professor Khare said, but Dr. Mohamed is sure that big cities will be an easier sell.
Because of the international cuisine based on oyster sauce and all those things, there are people in Bombay who are interested to buy from producers here.
I asked Chef Thomas of Bombay Canteen what he thought. He said that because there's no practice of eating raw oysters in our culture, people need to get used to the idea.
With something like oysters, it's not something you can suddenly put on a menu and say, okay, it's going to get sold out. It needs to be like a slow, consistent sort of an education to tell people that they can eat it, it's delicious. I mean, because people are not used to eating oysters in Bombay or anywhere in India for that matter.
Demand is something that can be worked out, but a regular supply is what's more crucial. In part 2, we're going to take a deep dive into oyster production and see what it'll take to get that supply going. This is Amrita Gupta for the Food Radio Project.
The Food Radio Project.
So we know that Indians aren't eating a whole ton of oysters. The oysters we are eating, we're not eating raw. I wanted to know a little bit more about the supply side of things. Is it because we don't have enough wild oysters? And do we farm a lot of oysters in India? That's the focus of this episode of the Food Radio Project. I called Vishal Bhave to find out more. Vishal's a scientist at the Bombay Natural History Society. He's working on a field project to document the diversity of mollusks along the entire coast of India. It turns out that scarcity isn't an issue. Vishal said there's a lot of local biodiversity along the Indian coast. We're still discovering new species of mussels, and there are 6 known species of oysters. Some of them are rock oysters found close to the shore, others are backwater oysters. All of them are edible. Vishal said that in his experience, it's the women who always collect oysters.
From single bed, they don't collect all oysters, but they pick bigger one or they know how to select. They collect matured oyster only and they leave small oyster to grow.
Traditional collection is sustainable, he said. And from what he's seen, it's on such a small scale that it hasn't endangered wild oyster populations.
There are few sites where those oysters are collected and sold in the local market. At least along where we work, oysters are used for non-commercial and local consumption only.
The Central Marine Fisheries Research Institute, or the CMFRI, began to develop technologies for commercial shellfish farming back in the 70s. The idea was to take a subsistence food and see if they could give it some market value. But it wasn't until 10 or 15 years ago that they started to really focus on oyster cultivation in a bigger way. Most of this is concentrated in the backwaters of Kerala, on the southwest coast of India. Dr. Sunil Mohamed, who leads the molluscan division at CMFRI, explained how exactly oysters are farmed.
The farmers set out their what we call as wrens. These are dead oyster shells strung onto a rope. They set it out at the time when which the larvae of the oysters are beginning to set. We call it setting. Okay. We keep these strings of shells in the water and the larvae come and settle on that. Then it's only a matter of as it grows, we cull it. We can't have more than about 8 or 10 oysters on one empty shell. There's not enough room for their growth.
Just like wild oyster harvesting, oyster farming too is predominantly done by women. I asked Dr. Mohamed why.
Both for oysters as well as mussels, the technology is very simple. Okay, and it is not in the sea, it is in the backwaters where access to women is also relatively easy.
Usually, groups of around 10 women come together and form self-help groups, or SHGs, and they set up a farm in the backwaters. The state supports them with a subsidy. Currently, India produces around 4,000 tons of oysters. That's not a lot. Globally, upwards of 5 million tons of oysters are farmed every year. Most of India's oysters are currently grown in Kerala, though the CMFRI is looking to expand production into other coastal states, like Maharashtra and Goa. Dr. Mohamed thinks there's good potential. He's confident that this kind of aquaculture will catch on. There are many reasons, but for one, unlike fish or shrimp farming, oysters don't have to be fed. They're filter feeders. That makes the system easy to maintain, and it's also great for the environment.
Essentially, in aquaculture, the problems, the environmental problems arise due to the feeding practice.
In shrimp farming and fish farming, excess feed leads to the eutrophication of water, when nitrogen and phosphorus compounds build up as pollutants. And it's not just that oyster cultivation isn't damaging to the environment. It's actually restorative.
Generally, bivalves are beneficial to any natural ecosystem in the sense that for example, an oyster would filter out about 12 liters, an adult oyster would filter about 12 liters of water in 1 hour. It's cleaning up the entire ecosystem.
Vishal Bhave added that oysters are also carbon and nitrogen sinks, effectively helping to mitigate the greenhouse gas effect.
We can see oyster in a different perspective other than food in terms of climate change and other things. That oyster also fix nitrogen like plants do, and also carbon dioxide also. So those can be used.
Globally, oysters remove as much nitrogen from the atmosphere as 100,000 square kilometers of forest. But the environmental advantages, at least for oyster farmers in India, won't be more than a side benefit. The real reason that oyster cultivation is attractive is that oysters are hardy and they can tolerate a wide range of salinity. Unlike mussels, they can survive India's monsoon rains, which can throw off salinity levels in the backwaters in a big way. Another thing is they grow fast.
In India, mussels can reach marketable size in about 4 to 5 months, and oysters about 7 to 8 months. Okay, the growth rate is very fast here, unlike in the west in temperate waters, where I think both mussels as well as oysters would take about 1.5 years to reach marketable size.
Dr. Mohamed said that in the future, there's also potential for oyster farmers to sell the shells for additional profit.
Oyster shells cannot be used for making cement because it is a porous nature, but it's used in the calcium tablet industry. It's one of the best sources of natural calcium.
But they aren't at that stage yet. He told me that with the help of the World Bank, they're still working to develop the value chain, right from production to consumption. They've already gotten into some aspects of processing: smoking, canning, pickling oysters, and so on. But the main focus is on selling oysters live rather than as shucked meat. That makes sense because it fetches a much better price. A farmer might get 1 rupee for every piece of meat, but they'll get about 15 times that for each live oyster. If demand grows, that price will go higher. Because of this focus on developing the live oyster supply chain, Dr. Mohamed said that they've set up several depuration units where oysters undergo a purification process. That's where they're continuously flushed with pure water for 12 hours or so to make sure that they're safe to eat raw.
In traditional practice, they don't do it. Okay, it's okay if you're the kind of cooking that we have in India. It is actually heated. I mean, there's a lot of heat there. Yeah, you'll never get sick because of that. But when you do take it live, that risk is there.
The CMFRI monitors the water quality where oyster farming is done as well. They're also in touch with the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India, the FSSAI. They're working to develop shellfish sanitation regulations along the lines of those in the EU and the US. But there's still a long way to go. They have to develop the market and the market linkages. The women's self-help groups usually manage one harvest a year, but live oysters are harvested on order. So once an order comes in, the oysters need to be harvested a day ahead, then they undergo 12 hours of purification, and then they're packed and dispatched. Dr. Mohamed said that the women often struggle to make sure that the supply happens on time, and they need to get more support before they can improve. But for the restaurant industry, a regular supply is probably the most important factor to putting oysters on the menu. And currently, it's not something they can count on. That's what Chef Thomas Zacharias at the Bombay Canteen told me.
Firstly, getting oysters in their shell is very difficult and close to impossible for me as a chef. Secondly, getting them from a reliable source is even more difficult.
The CMFRI has airlifted orders of live oysters to large hotel chains like the Taj, so getting oysters to other states is complicated enough. Importing them from another country definitely wouldn't be a good option. Chef Thomas's seafood suppliers in Mumbai have standing instructions to bring oysters in if they see them, but they rarely do. With oyster cultivation just starting out in India and really only developed in the state of Kerala, that's going to take some time. In other parts of the country, farmed oysters still aren't a common sight in most markets.
There's no mounds of oysters sitting there. It's just one quiet lady in a corner selling oysters, and it's never in the shell.
And until oysters are produced in larger quantities, they're also going to be too expensive to go mainstream. The last time Thomas served oysters, he bought them for 40 rupees a piece, probably after they'd been through a few middlemen.
40 a piece for something that ends up weighing about 15 to 20 grams. So you're talking about 2,000 rupees a kilo for the meat. That's as expensive as imported fish.
Of course, there's still the question of whether we'll start to like eating oysters raw in the first place. We talked about why oysters make most Indians squeamish in part 1 of this podcast. I'm Amrita Gupta for the Food Radio Project.